Hello, and welcome to Discord Q&A number 37. There's something cool about the number 37, I think, but we don't need to talk about that. Let's just get right into the Q&A. Is it an intentional design decision that Baron cannons do not remove backdoor protection? Short answer, yes. Longer answer is this is something that we considered pretty heavily when we were making the change to Baron cannon minions to give them that additional range, many years ago. And we tried it both ways, and the conclusion was, and this ties back to the original goals, which I'll get to in a second. But the conclusion was, hey, if the Baron cannon minions remove backdoor bonus, that naturally means that the end result of that is not that the Baron Cannon minion provides a slow chip out sieging tool. Instead, what it provides is a window of opportunity for a tanky champion, right, like a Malphite especially, right, but even fighters in some cases, right, like your Renekton or whatever, to walk up, take a couple tower shots, and your entire team to just blast the tower down very, very quickly in situations, especially where you're significantly more powerful than the enemy team, right? And so it ended up being more of a blowout mechanic rather than something that would help teams that had the Baron advantage, but not a lot of other meaningful advantages on the enemy team. Basically, we wanted Baron to be able to reliably generate chip damage and hopefully eventually, in most cases, tower kills, right? The Baron is really important for ending the game. And we have to consider how Baron buff is used in different situations, right? And the goal of adding range to those cannon minions was not that it would make it so that Baron trivially let you blow through the enemy base, even in cases where the enemy team could clear out the regular minion wave, right? Um, However, what it was instead was, this idea of, oh, well, even if you're not super ahead, the Baron should be able to enable you to take out some towers, get chip damage on some towers. Hopefully, hopefully generate an advantage off of that if you're able to get the Baron without paying too high of a cost for that, right? Now, this is one of those things where these decisions, this design work was done many years ago, and it hasn't, Baron buff in general and its outputs haven't really been super deeply reconsidered since that time. And so we might come to a different conclusion, especially as things in the game have changed over the years, right? One example of one of the big things in relation to this that's changed is that towers do more damage now, and in particular, tower damage ramps a lot more aggressively now, and ramping maintains for a lot longer than it did when we made these changes in the first place, right? And so if we were reconsidering from the ground up the outputs of Baron today, or Baron buff, I guess I should say, today, and like how that how that buffs the minions, we might make different conclusions. Where we might not even decide, oh, the range on the cannon should be exactly this amount, right? Maybe it should be more, maybe it should be less, right? Maybe the Baron minions, buff on minions should make them more durable and give them less damage, or vice versa, right? Maybe they should do more damage and be less durable, right? Maybe they should have other effects that we give them, right? I think there's a lot of possibilities here around the Baron buff and the exact outputs. But the reality is we haven't reconsidered this because Baron is a pretty, the Baron buff is a pretty critical forcing function for ending games. And so we generally find, hey, if it's working well, we generally don't want to mess with it. It's one of those things where the relative value of making changes here is probably not worth the time that we would need to spend validating them, right? Like the current Baron buff works on live, and uh, making good changes to Baron buff and its outputs would take a lot of time, a lot of validation. We would want to be really high confidence because this is a really, 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 really important system, right? This is something where if something goes wrong with this, it actually disrupts the entire game. Where like the entire game flow is based around the idea that Baron will help, Baron's buff will help you end the game, and so because of all of that. Uh, it's one of those situations where, yeah, this version of Baron buff works. Is it perfect? Is it the ideal set of mechanics? Maybe, maybe not, right? Anyway, though, like either way, the way that I look at this is that I do, if the point being made here is, hey, this isn't the most intuitive thing, I tend to agree with that, right? Like, I don't think people see this Baron minion or this Baron cannon being able to shoot the tower and think, oh, yeah, I surely won't be able to hit the tower because it's not in range, but the Baron Cannon minion can do full damage, right? I don't think it's super intuitive. And that is, I think, maybe a slight knock against the mechanic. But ultimately, if it gets the right gameplay that we want, right, it has the right properties that we want, and it's learnable, and it's something that players will actually be able to learn very easily because you're just going to get Baron in a lot of your games, right? And so having a slightly unintuitive part of Baron that has slightly better overall gameplay, or like slightly overall better structure for the way that we want Baron to end games. And it's just a mild point of learning for players, on something that's unintuitive. That does not bother me, right? Again, like I said, there might be a better version of Baron buff out there, right? That doesn't have this kind of, like, to me, kind of an ear flicky thing around, like, yeah, it's probably not ideal, but it works well, and I think the structure of it is totally fine. Um, this does not seem like a real meaningful problem. And again, to kind of reiterate, it's just Baron buff is a really important system for the game, and so anytime we want to make any kind of change to it, we would want to do a lot of validation on that. And so since Baron buff is currently working, I'm not super inclined to say like, oh yeah, maybe we should look at changing this. It's like, well, I don't know, it works, right? So it seems like it's something that I think probably should stay, at least unless we want to totally reconsider how Baron buff actually ends games for whatever reason. Cosmic Drive's place in the AP Bruiser system. What's the gameplay fantasy? So something I do want to be clear about is that when I made this version of Cosmic Drive back for, this was in 2023. So at this point, it was over 3 years ago when I made it, because I made the AP item system pretty early in the year. But when I made this version of Cosmic Drive, uh, I wasn't intending it to only be for fighters, right? I was thinking a lot about like Silas, for example, but I was also thinking about champions like Syndra, right? Like some of our, ranged AP champions that, whether they're mages or battle mages or whatever, that care a lot about moving fast, that care a lot about casting a lot of spells, right? Even champions like Cassio, right? Some of the battle mages was, where I was kind of, my head was at the time, and the idea that I had at the time was, hey, if you want to cast a lot of spells, you're going to be, putting yourself in cast times a lot of the time, right? Syndra aside, right? When I was thinking about champions like, say, Cassiopeia or even Silas, right? It's like casting a lot of spells. Like when you get a lot of haste, you're essentially reducing your movement speed in some ways, right? Like because you're rooting yourself or stunning yourself essentially by casting spells, right? Like most spells have a 0.25 second cast time on them where you don't move, right? And so the idea of this version of Cosmic Drive was, okay, well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make the downside of getting a lot of haste lower by giving you a lot of movement speed. So when you are moving, you do get to catch up to people, and you don't have to worry about having a lot of haste being detrimental to your ability to catch up to people. And that I wasn't expecting that to be part of the fantasy, to be clear. I was expecting that to be part of the functionality of the item, right? Not for that to be something that people would notice or feel really, but more so that they would feel, oh, this is the item where I want to cast a lot of spells and go fast, right? That was really supposed to be what the item fantasy was supposed to be. Very simple, straightforward. Just, hey, I want to cast a lot of spells. Uh, I want to be able to make sure I can keep up with or kite my enemies, whatever is appropriate based on your champion. That was the idea. However, this has never really worked, and I would say no version of Cosmic Drive we've ever had has really ever worked for this space. And I think to some degree, this space may just be cursed, where the something, this is a tangentially related space, but if you want to hear more about this, you can go watch my video on the items for this season. But I spent a lot of time iterating on this idea of a big AP, big haste stat stick. And that's something that I think a lot of people expect would be an easy item to make, both designers and players. I think like, oh, well, of course, there's lots of champions that like AP and haste. And it turns out it's actually really hard. I actually don't think there's a easy solution to that, where haste as a stat on its own, I think, is actually not super compelling in the AP space. Like big AP works because all these champions care a lot about getting big AP values, whether you're trying to, one shot someone like a LeBlanc, or whether you're trying to get value out of your, your rotation and make yourself, effectively more durable because you're Silas or whatever, right? You're getting more healing from your AP ratio, whatever the case might be, right? I think the AP hate, like big, haste focused space is a lot more difficult to work in and a lot less generic than you might expect. And I think that's one of the problems that affects Cosmic Drive as well, is the haste, like big haste is actually something that's hard for a lot of these champions to justify paying for. Um, and I think ultimately the way that I look at Cosmic Drive is I am suspicious, I am a bit dubious that we are supposed to combine these stats in this way, where the item is mostly about the stats that it's providing, right? Especially now after the passive has been nerfed, right? The original version that I shipped at the beginning of season 14 was the passive was significantly more powerful. I don't remember how much movement speed it has, but I know it was a lot more. I think it was like 40 or something crazy, like 60 or something like that. Maybe I think it was level scaling. I don't even remember. It was a long time ago at this point. But either way, uh, regardless of the tuning, the way that the item is shaped is it's mostly about the stats, and I think what it actually needs is a compelling, unique effect that has clear hooks and clear desire for uh, this like a specific audience. In fact, I think a lot of this comes down to some of the same problems that Eclipse has as an item in its current form, where Eclipse is so generic and so unopinionated that it ends up having this problem of like, okay, so if it's this unopinionated, who's excited about buying it, and like when is it ever better than their item that they can buy that's a little bit more tailored to their champion, right? Actually, I think Sundered Sky has this problem as well, where it's like, well, yeah, when Sundered Sky is really powerful, everybody, every jungle fighter wants it, right? And I think Cosmic Drive would be very similar. If we made it, one of the most powerful AP items in the game, right? If we made it like the best AP item in the game, power wise, every AP champion would be buying it, right? Because it's so unopinionated, it's so generic in a way that's not actually very interesting in the same way that like some of our other more exciting generic items like Deathcap are. Anyway, to sort of wrap around here on my thought on Cosmic Drive is like to answer the question directly, the gameplay fantasy was supposed to be you cast a lot of spells and you move fast. Really not anything crazy, right? Like not anything super exciting. But I think the item is pretty flat, and I think what I would like to see in the future is maybe a more pointed, a more narrow, more specific version that speaks more to I want Cosmic Drive because my kit says this thing. Or I want Cosmic Drive because this unique effect is really good in this situation, or something like that, right? Whereas the current version is just so generic and so unopinionated that it's very hard for it to find a place in the AP system amongst some of our other more compelling unopinionated items like Deathcap or Shadow Flame. Shadow Flame at least has like it says like, hey, I'm about to, I can buy a large rod and I want to burst someone, right? And I think Cosmic Drive just doesn't quite hit the same. Doesn't quite hit the same kind of a space as the other like more compelling generic items if I were putting it that way. And so ultimately it's an item that I would not be surprised if we wanted to change at some point in the future because I don't think it's quite really working in its current form. Sets Pit Grit regen passive having no interaction with W Grit. And this person was asking were they ever related and why or why not. And my answer to this is sort of no and sort of yes, right? They're both getting at sort of the same sort of core part of the set champion fantasy that we were trying to design around, or like Axe's when he was making the original kit design around. Fun fact about Set is actually the original kit design, like a lot of the structure of the kit and like the spells was done by Axe's, and then he was got a lot of modifications and was finished out by Twin Enso, and so work by two designers there. Something this is not that relevant to this question, but just noting, we typically like people typically assume that there's always like there's one designer responsible for a champion. A lot of champions though are made by like really like actually worked on pretty extensively by more than one game designer, and so we say like, oh, this champion was made Aphelios was made by this designer, right? Or like certainly T or whatever. It's like, well, that's not exactly true, right? He made the original kit. He got to the shape of this champion has 5 guns, and you swap them with W, and you cast your spell with Q. But Stasio actually finished out a lot of the mechanics, like a lot of the actual guns, and is the person who shipped the kit, and actually did a lot of the other work on Aphelios. Anyway, Set's a similar champion where just worked on a lot by 2 designers. Getting to the actual point here of the question is Set's Pit Grit, where he has more regen at low HP, and his W Grit, where he gets paid out for taking damage, are both trying to get at the fantasy of the turnaround character, right? Like the guy who gets more dangerous at low HP, or the guy who has this like big threat, even if he's very low on HP, he exudes a lot of threat to the enemies, and this is something that you might notice a lot of our juggernauts have, right? Like Darius Q heals based on missing health, right? Alawi Tentacles heal based on missing health, right? We have a lot of mechanics on our juggernauts to make them dangerous at lower HP, because one of the really big positives we get out of this is that this actually encourages the juggernauts to not just leave fights when they get chunked to 40% health, right? There's a lot of promise, there's a lot of fantasy in, oh, it's actually worth trying to fight it out when you're low. And there's something really compelling about the idea that you get more, as the Juggernaut player, you get more and more dangerous. And there's these moments of tension as you get low. And as the person playing against, this is something that's very learnable around like, oh, well, if I can't actually finish off set, if I don't save a little bit of burst, or I put too much damage into his W grit and he gets to turn around on me, that's a really dangerous situation that you've put yourself in, and you can learn to play around those situations, right? uh Ultimately, like, both of these passives are trying to get at Set being the turnaround guy, and like being this like originally was called the prototype, or the what was it, the code name was Grappler. Originally was the like, oh, this like grappler or boxer, or like pit fighter of some kind, that punches and has these the potential for these supreme comebacks, right? If you've ever watched like a boxing match of like, oh, he's down but he's not out, right? Like, didn't get, he could get back up and try and make these punches happen, right? That was a lot of like where the theming for Set was inspired from, and some of the mechanics. And so ultimately, the answer to the actual question is no. These were never part of the same effect, these were never part of the same passive, but they are both derived from the same sort of motivation around Set can be knocked down but not knocked out, right? Like that's the kind of the whole origin of this idea. uh and so ultimately they do synergize in a lot of ways. I actually don't remember which one came first. I was not crazy involved, I was not like super involved in Set's development, but I think I don't remember what I was doing at the time. I was doing working on something else, just very heavily. But uh my recollection was that these mechanics were both just put there as, hey, the W is part of the core mechanic. I think the W came first, actually. The W grit came first, I think. And the regen passive, I think, was more, hey, we want this champion to function a certain way in like these extended lane fights, and actually have some tools, like a tool that we have, a lever that we have access to, that enables us to make him a little bit more resilient in lane over the long period of time, or over a long period of time rather than a short one. And so if you look at the two types of the two like take damage slash like low HP kind of things here, you can kind of look at these as the W grid is covering the short term case of you get chunked for a lot of damage in a short period of time, and the passive regen is covering the you get worn down over a long period of time, but you still have the ability to like come back from that and like scrap it out, because you have this passive regen. So they're sort of covering the two cases of like, oh, we need to make sure that this champion can be knocked down but still uh have the ability to like to punch back. That's sort of what they're there for. But no, they were not the same passive at any point, or like not the same part of the same spell or anything of that kind. How much room is there for Rocketbelt becoming a blink instead of a dash? So I thought this was an interesting question to put in here, and so I did. But I don't think it's framed very well, because the way that this question is presenting it is asking this as a pure power question, right? Like, how much room is there to make this thing happen, right? Like, the answer to this is none, right? Like, Rocketbelt is probably too powerful on live in some ways, and it's powerful in the wrong ways for what it's worth, right? Uh, but this is not really like, power is not really the way that I look at this, right? Like, blinks versus dashes, I think, is a very interesting uh, thing you can examine, because blinks are not strictly better than dashes, right? You can imagine a blink which has a 1 second cast time, and takes you 300 units. It's like, well, that's worse than most dashes, right? Like, in terms of just traversing the ground. It is, traversing area, right? It is the case that that's a really bad blink, but even some really fast dashes are better than a lot of blinks in some situations, right? Like, Kaisa ult, for example, is simply an extremely fast dash. And it's better than most blinks most of the time, right? And part of that's that it's an ultimate, right? And it has a lot of power budget in it, right? But the average blink is better than the average dash. But there's a lot of other considerations that go into blinks versus dashes. One of the big ones, I would say, like, that's particularly relevant for this case, which is on an item, is that blinks need to have a lot of extra considerations around visual communication of the effect, right? Dashes get this for free, especially, slower dashes, but even relatively fast dashes get a lot of visual value for free because you can literally see the unit that is dashing moving in the path that they're moving at the speed of the dash, right? So one of the things that's dangerous about making really, really, really fast dashes that can be repeated a lot, right? This is like Aurelia Q, for example, is that the champion becomes very difficult to parse and difficult to track when they do this in combat. One of the advantages Kaisa has is that even though her ultimate dash is extremely fast, is extremely fast. It only happens once, and it's like this one singular big moment that you can see Kaisa do. And there's some good there's some specific particles that we have and some VFX that we made to make this very clear. Blinks, though, because the champion, for the assuming it's a champion, the person on your screen just disappears one area, it appears the another. We have to do a lot of work to communicate that visually to the players, and this is something that would be really hard to do on an item. I'm not saying it's impossible. I think we could do it if we really wanted to, and we've actually had prototypes that did this before. In fact, one of the early versions of the slot that would eventually be Everfrost was a item that would, a mage item that would like basically very long, like delayed, like I'm going to blink to this location, but only after a few seconds. Anyway, don't need to talk about that. It's an interesting concept, but anyway, talking about blinks and their communication, most of the blinks that we have, especially the ones that are repeatable, like Katarina E, have a lot of extra VFX work that is done on them in order to make sure that it is clear to players where the champion is going and what is happening on their screen. And even with that being the case, some of our champions that blink quickly, especially without real cast times and good animation support, aren't super trackable, right? Yasuo is a good example. I think Yasuo and Katarina are the two examples I would give of really, really well executed, well communicated blinks. Katarina does this with a lot of VFX trails that aren't really super visible unless you're looking for them. But even though you're not, actually seeing them in the moment, like you're not like consciously aware of them, it's a very, very easy to see them if you're looking for them. Like if you go back to, watch, go find a clip of Katarina blinking around and then play the clips out very slowly. And you can see there's some smears and some trails that indicate like, hey, Katarina blinked over here. And that allows your eyes to easily track where the Katarina is going when she's blinking all over your screen. Yasuo Ultimate actually has a whole clone of Yasuo that it spawns visually between him and his target if he's far enough away. All sorts of like well conducted VFX that happen over the course of like a quarter of a second, I think, maybe like half a second. But they're really important to let your mind, even though you're not consciously aware of these things happening, to let your mind actually see like, oh, this person is going over there. This item is letting them go over there. And one of the difficulties with doing this on an item is that we attach a lot of these things to animations on champions, and items don't get to access a champion's animation, champions like unique animations, right? In the same way that we do with blinks that are on champion kits. And so that would be one barrier. Not saying we couldn't ever do it. It just means we'd have to really pump the VFX and potentially like the warning, and potentially like make sure the thing is delayed if we wanted to do a blink on an item. It's just we wouldn't be able to do custom animations, which limits some of the things that we could do to communicate these things. But it's not a blocker. It's just a limiter. All of this stuff about the visual communication of blinks versus dashes having been said, I don't think that Protobot is supposed to be a blink. I don't actually think there's any upside in this, in fact, for Protobot. In fact, I think, if anything, I think Protobot's dash might be too good at doing some of the things that it's doing. My view on Protobot right now, and I think you can see this, some of my opinion has been colored by the way that it's been used by mages this year as we buffed it and buffed it and buffed it in terms of its stats. The point of Protobalt, both to a lesser extent in the mythic system and the version that I put into the when I was demythicking everything and putting the items back to regular legendaries. The point of Protobelt in the game is to provide an extra bit of reach at the cost of damage for a class of a subclass of our AP champions that are good at finishing people off, but are not good at 100 to zeroing people until later in the game, or if they're very far ahead, right? This is champions like Echo and champions like Annie, where the idea of Protobelt, I'm not saying it's done this in quite some time, right? To be clear, I'm not saying this was effective, but the point of it, closer to its original purpose, was, hey, Annie, if you don't care about 100 to zeroing people until later in the game, you're willing to delay that spike of when you can actually kill someone 100 to 0, we can give you a bit of extra reach, right? Especially if you're one of the champions like Annie that's not particularly great at actually getting to their target, right? Echo is another example of a champion that's not particularly good at killing someone from 100% HP. He is good at killing people from like 50% HP. He's actually very good at that. And so having access to an item for him that says this will let you traverse more distance and have an easier time accessing the targets that you want to hit that might be a little lower, have already been damaged by your teammates or whatever. But this comes at a trade-off of your actual damage. That's what Protobelt is for. And that I think is a pretty compelling space in the item system. Protobelt is not designed for random mages buying it in their second or third slot and using it to dodge skill shots. Personally, I don't actually mind that being a real use case for the item if there's particularly valuable things for them to dodge or kite away from in a given game. But very clearly to me, the version that was in the game earlier this year before it was nerfed, where it was very popular, second or third item for a lot of mages, where they weren't really giving up anything in order to go for that, right? They still had a lot of damage. It was just a very stat efficient item. That did not sit right with me in terms of how people were using the item because the mages weren't giving anything up in order to access this ability to dodge. It's like, well, you kind of get this dash sort of for free because the item was so insanely efficient. And it was offering, not only did it offer just like relatively efficient AP, but also a lot of health. And so even when you did get hit by a skill shot, you didn't really pay the price for that. And so it was offering a really compelling stat package that was hard to get that combination elsewhere. And then on top of that, you were just kind of getting a dash that gave you a lot of agency that you weren't really paying the correct price for. Again, I want to be clear. It's like I'm fine with mages buying Protobelt sometimes when it's a good situation for it, or you're a player who particularly gets a lot of who's able to generate a lot of value out of that. But the version of this that people were doing earlier, and I think still even on a couple mages are still doing, I think is just not sufficiently large of a trade-off in order to make that work. And making it a blink would actually, assuming that the blink is relatively similar or slightly higher in power than the dash, would only make those use cases more powerful. Instead, my suspicion of like, as an example of something that I might be interested in doing for Protobelt in the future, is because it's not fulfilling this use case around allowing champions like Annie or Echo to actually close on targets more easily. One of the things that I think about doing is maybe bringing back some of the movement speed that was on the item in the Mythic system, where saying, hey, when you activate Protobelt, it also gives you a bonus movement speed buff against when you're moving towards enemies or something like that. And so it's better for chasing down enemies. And in that world, maybe we make the dash a little bit like lower range, or make it a little bit higher cooldown or something. And just generally say, hey, the dash itself is not quite as good, but your ability to close on a target when you activate this thing is better. And so we can potentially, get champions like an Echo or like a Diana or whatever to actually be interested in this item when they just need to close on a target. They're not as worried about having all that damage, or they're willing to take a trade-off on their damage. And so that's all assuming that we even want that to support that use case. I think it's also fair to say we maybe as a game have just moved past that, right? I think Protobelt 10 years ago was a pretty compelling item in the system. And there were a lot of champions that actually wanted and had a high desire for that effect. But the game has changed a lot, and to be honest, I'm not confident we really even need or necessarily want that kind of shape, that kind of effect in the system. I'm not personally opposed to it, but I'm also not confident that the game really needs Echo or Annie to have an option to trade off a bit of damage for a bit of target access. Like, is that actually important for them? Is that good for them to have access to that option? Probably, but I'm not 100% confident that that's true. And so in general, my viewpoint on this is I think it's extremely unlikely we would ever make Protobelt a blink over a dash. Like, in general, I think it's unlikely we ever make a item that blinks you because we won't have access, like on an item specifically, we don't have access to like custom animations on champions. We would have to do the communication of the blink purely with VFX, which is a restriction, right? Again, it's not a total blocker, right? But it does mean that it'll be harder to communicate where the champion is going. And so that's like a delayed blink effect, like the one that we tested, many years ago for Mythics, where like the mage plants a spot on the ground and says like after X seconds I'm going to blink to this location. that is a pretty compelling version of that. Whereas, like, yeah, I could believe that we'd have an item like that in the systems, where it's very easy for us to like make clear to everyone, hey, by the way, the mage is going to go there in 2 seconds or whatever, right? Anyway, like I said, I think it's unlikely we'd have an instant blink in our items just because of some of the difficulty of communicating it and how much power it would require to make a blink that actually feels good in the item system. But it's not an impossibility. In general, though, like just wrapping back around to the original question, like I said, on the current version of Protobot, the current version of Protobot is like objectively, it's pretty powerful. Even after the nerfs, like the version before the nerfs was just one of the best items in the game, just like from like a pure statistical perspective. And so the answer in the current game is just none. I think like I think negative room probably. Like the dash probably is not like the dash in its current form, like the actual mobility aspect of it, of like traversing distance, is probably not really where we want more of the power budget of the item. Uh, and so that's my thoughts on this. Why tank items don't interact with immobilizing effects anymore? So there's a few reasons behind this, right? If you look at some of the changes that have been made over the past, I don't know, 7 or 8 years or something like that, the two that stand out in my mind immediately when I read this question of like removal are something like an even shroud and something like the immobilized trigger sunfire. So I think there's a few reasons why we've removed these. Something to note is that the ones I can think of are all first items. And one of the difficulties we ran into, especially with the immobilized trigger, Sunfire, where it would like burst damage, there was something very cool about that. However, it also made the item really unattractive for some of the intended users, right? Mundo is probably the best example. Shen is another pretty good one where it's like, well, Shen only has one immobilize. It's not very high reliability. You might never get value out of this effect. In fact, in a lot of fights, you're never going to get value out of this effect, or you're going to get very minimal value out of this effect uh, in comparison to a champion like a Maokai or a Sejuani or like an Amumu or anything like that, right? Even Zac, is a good example of like someone who gets more value out of it than Shen. But there's also champions like Sion, right? Like who's a tank who doesn't reliably immobilize people, right? And so one of the problems we ran into with this on first items that we wanted to be broadly accessible tank items is not all of our tanks reliably immobilize champions. And so the difference between, even with a cooldown that we had, the difference in how reliable immobilizes are and how their cooldowns line up is different even amongst the tanks, right? Like the difference between how much value Zac gets out of this kind of effect versus how much value Maokai gets out of this kind of effect, or Mumu, right? Like who are like very high end users, is very large, right? And so effects that have a short cooldown on immobilize that are supposed to be broadly accessible items don't really work that well, right? And so we've reshaped these to on these broadly accessible items in order to make those function in the way that they were supposed to, right? Like with Sunfire, being more generic, and even Shroud, being removed from the game for a variety of reasons. But uh, that doesn't mean that we can't have immobilizing triggers later on in builds or on items that are intended to be more narrow and accessible by a smaller cast of champions. I would probably be surprised if we wanted to do this in the first slot without a lot of reshaping, because to me the tank first slot actually has a lot of items, right? You think about there's two Sunfire capes, there's Sunfire Hollow Radiance, there's Heart Steel, there's Despair for some champions, there's Canic Rookern, which can be good for some champions and in some matchups, right? There's a variety of tank support items you can go, right? This is things like Locket, things like Bandle Pipes. Support tanks have lots of options. Bandle Pipes, by the way, does have an immobilized trigger on it, right? It just also triggers on slows, because when I was making the item originally, I did have only an immobilized trigger on it. And then my conclusion after working with it for a bit was, well, I actually think it should just also work on slows, because uh, that makes it more accessible for more of the tank supports, like Braum, for example, who doesn't have a reliable upfront immobilize outside of his ultimate, right? But he does have the ability to just queue people to trigger this thing, right? And so adding the slow trigger to it, for me, was just the way that I was looking at Vandal Push at the time was just a lot of upside comparatively to doing just immobilized triggers, and so I quite liked that. Adding that line instead of it just being a mobilized trigger. However, all this stuff having been said, kind of to the point I was making earlier, is I think there would be nothing wrong at all with us having like a second item or a more targeted first item. Or some item that is intended to go in later slots that has an immobilized trigger on it. as long as we're okay with Mundo not wanting that item, as long as we're okay with Shen and Scion and even Ornn, right, not being interested in this item, if it's tied to reliably accessing Immobilize, something that like a good example is like Aftershock still exists in the game, and I think Aftershock actually works pretty well, where it's for champions that reliably immobilize you and want to and go in at the same time. Great, that's awesome for Leona, right? That's awesome for Nautilus, right? For a set of these champions that have that pattern. But it just happens to line up with a lot of the items that we've previously had immobilized triggers on. Either didn't either had other problems, which is like Even Shroud, or were intended to be very broadly accessible across and perform, and were intended to perform a pretty important function for the tank roster, which is like Sunfire, where it's like, well, this is supposed to be the item that helps you clear waves, right, and gives you AOE DPS, right, and helps you clear the jungle, whatever, right, and so as long as that's the case, we don't really want to lock it behind a relatively restrictive effect that does not work for a lot of their tank roster. That's really the ultimate reason why this is the way that it is. It's not some intentional, targeted campaign against this because we don't like them or anything. It's just immobilizing effects have pretty specific meaning around who in the tank system is good at using them, because some of our tanks are so much better at reliably immobilizing people than other tanks. There's a lot of differences there, in much the same way that some of our 80 carries are really good at triggering on-hit effects a lot, and some of our 80 carries really like crit, right? It's like, I don't look at this as being that different from, say, like a stat binding, right, amongst subclasses of a like larger scale class of and the comparison I'm making, it's like the marksman class, right? It's like some of the marksmen really like attack speed, some of them just want a lot of AD, like Draven, right? I kind of look at this as being similar, except on a smaller scale, where it's not like a stat binding, it's like a mechanic binding. But I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't have an item in this space in the future if we found a good place for it. In fact, I actually wouldn't be surprised if we wanted to make one of these in the future, if we were looking for a new tank item, because the space of, hey, the tanks that are really good at immobilizing, feels like there could be an item for them out there that would be particularly exciting, because I think in our current armor system especially, Despair is supposed to occupy the generic space, but it has a lot of implications. Despair has a lot of implications about like team fighting, and being really truly tanky enough to get value out of this thing, that I think aren't necessarily the best for being a super generic item. And so I think making Despair a little bit more targeted itself, and then introducing another targeted item to cover some of the other use cases, is something that I could see us doing at some point. Not saying we will for sure or won't, but like that's a possibility to me, for some time in the future. Treasure Hunter versus Cashback. This person was specifically asking about why the break-even point for these two minor runes is 6,000 gold spent. This is something where there's no, like, when these runes were made, which we're talking about Cashback here, right? Because Treasure Hunter is much older than Cashback. When Cashback was made, it wasn't designed specifically with the intent that it would overtake Treasure Hunter at a specific item breakpoint. That was not how this item, like how this rune was designed or tuned. The way that it works, when we're looking at these two, is gold is something that we can give in the rune system that has clear value. But these two are very different runes in how they approach giving you gold and how we treat their gold. Treasure Hunter is a snowball rune, right? It says kill everyone on the enemy team and you spike, and then you're done. You don't get gold after that, right? It's early game snowball gold, right? Like when you're getting kills, when you're getting ahead, you get value out of this rune. Cashback, on the other hand, is extremely consistent. You buy items, you get value, right? It's something that is guaranteed to give you value over the course of a longer game. And gold, there's a statement that I like to repeat in the cases like this. Like, when you're playing League, you should always discount the future, right? Like gold early is substantially more valuable than gold late game, right? And so something like Cashback gets to actually just give you more like raw value over the course of a typical game, right? It gives you more gold because the gold comes in later than the treasure hunter gold on average. However, the treasure hunter gold does have the advantage of it's risky, right? You're not guaranteed to get this at any specific point during the game. There's lots of games people would play with treasure hunter where they're sitting on 3 or 4 stacks and they never they don't get the fourth or fifth stack until much later on in the game, and so they end up getting locked out of this. It's unreliable. Whereas cashback is a lot more reliable. You will buy items if the game goes long enough eventually, right? Obviously, there are games where you end up super far behind. You don't buy a lot of items. You don't get a lot of value out of cashback, right? But that's less common than treasure hunter just sitting at 2-3 stacks for 15 20 minutes in the game, right? You just never kill that enemy top laner. You just never find a time to interact with them, or you never interact with the enemy jungler, or the enemy AD carry just never happens to die, or whatever, right? Anyway, the break-even point is not something that we were super heavily considering when these were made. I'm sure that the designer who made cashback like thought about it at some point when the tuning was being done, but this is not something where there's like deep design insights into, wow, they need to be, it needs to be at exactly 6,000 gold because that's typically going to be about 2 items. And that's when we need the cashback rune to take over from the treasure hunter, right? It's like people are generally not going to be comparing these runes one to one because they're actually for very different audiences, right? Treasure hunter, again, is like about early game snowballing, and cashback is about late game scaling. And you don't typically want to combine those two. Obviously, there are champions that just like gold enough that they might consider, having both of these, or they might consider just taking double gold runes. But the break-even point on these between them is not something I consider to be super, super important. Now, all of this having been said, why is it 6,000 gold? Well, that's about 2 items. And if you think about scaling versus early game spiky snowballing stuff, I think 2 items is actually a really good point. Like it's actually just kind of a nice, convenient threshold that people can imagine where it's like, hey, at what point is the scaling AD carry, the Jinx or something, supposed to start being more useful than the snowballing Talon mid or something like that, right? It's like, well, I like from my perspective, I kind of say probably somewhere, or in terms of usefulness in the game, probably somewhere in the 2 to 3 item range, right? Like the Talon gets to flip over walls and completely dominate the game a lot of the time, or before people get their first item, on the 1 item spike, and up into people getting 2 items. And often cases, like very frequently, the Talon will have a lot more items than other people and will hit the 2 item, 3 item spikes before other people, especially if the snowballing is going successfully for the Talon, right? And when the Jinx becomes more, sort of generically useful, I think, or it doesn't have to be Jinx, the marksman, say, or the mage or whatever, happening around 2 items, I think gives the Talon a lot of time to take advantage of their early game power. Or like the generic assassin, like early game skewed champion. It doesn't have to be an assassin even, right? It could just be a random early game champion like a Lee Sin or something like that. The Lee Sin, the Xin Zhao, whatever, right? It gives you a lot of time to do stuff, and the break-even point being around 2 items doesn't even necessarily mean that cashback is suddenly better when you hit 2 items, right? Again, remember, the treasure hunter gold comes in earlier, and so them being the same amount of gold at 6,000 gold doesn't actually mean that cashback is better at 2 items, right? Because you got that gold so much later than the treasure hunter gold on average comes in. And so the actual like sort of true break even in value point, or like the point where the value of cashback starts to overtake, is about 3 items, which I think also makes sense, right? Where you have this sort of nebulous area around 2 items where some of our early game snowballing champions, they get to hit their item break points early. And, I think it's fair to say that even if they're in an even situation, some 2 item situations, they should be more useful than, the marksman or the mage or whatever, right? Even, the lightly or heavily scaling champion. And I think that's fine, right? But I think about 2 items feels like a nice turning point where cashback can start to give similar or slightly higher value. But that doesn't mean that it's actually more powerful, like treasure hunter, because the gold comes in earlier on average. It's more valuable at that, like in those earlier times, right? Like getting an extra longsword at 5 minutes is way more powerful than getting an extra longsword at 25 minutes, right? And so the value of that is around 2 to 3. The 2 to 3 item point, I think, is a great break point for, hey, this is where the scalers should start taking over, and be more powerful generally than the early game snowballers. And so that's, I think, where we ended up with this, like both in terms of just like pure power tuning, but also in terms of like the shape of the game. Why does Aphelios reload not scale off attack speed? So I will answer this question in a bit, but let me first tell a story about Aphelios' development and my role in that that I don't think I've ever told before on stream or on in any of these Discord Q and A's. I think this is probably a story that's never been heard before. I don't think outside of Riot, but back when Aphelios was in development, I was on GAT, the game analysis team. And the way that GAT used to do champion development from an analysis perspective, they have a different system now, but the way that GAT used to do uh, champion development was there would be a pod of three analysts. There would be one would be the lead, who would be in charge of understanding, like, hey, the designer is currently working on these things, and so therefore we need to focus test on around these two spells right now, or oh well the designer's iterating and right now actually the artists are working on this spell and we really need to get good VFX feedback about how this spell looks and whether it's accurate and like whether it like reads well to enemies and to allies and stuff like that, like all those kinds of things, right? Like they're just aware of what the champion needs from GAT at any given time, right? And the other members of the pod are there both to provide support in terms of like keeping up with all of those things, especially if the lead is out, right? One of the reasons why we went to 3-person pods was we ran into a lot of difficulties with having singular leads where if you go back in the day, like with the Aatrox, for example, it was like, oh well, the Aatrox lead analyst is out, so I had to go, talk to Jag about what he needs for Aatrox VGU today, and I'd have to go figure out where he was, talk to him for 5 to 10 minutes, like, hey, he's working on A, B, and C today. They do the interpretation of like, okay, that means we need to put in feedback about X, Y, and Z. Okay, now we have to figure out like how many playtests can we actually get for Aatrox, right? It's like it's better to have someone constantly, like a collection of people constantly on top of that, rather than scrambling to get that done like day of if the lead happens to be out or whatever. But also because it can be really valuable to have a variety of different perspectives, right? Another thing that happened with some of the in the past with some of the heavily focused, like, hey, this one analyst is playing 80 to 90% of the games on a champion in development in the GAT test, right? Not in total, right? There are other playtests besides the GAT test, but in the GAT test is you miss out on other perspectives, and so having other people on the champion pod that can provide alternative perspectives can be really, really, really valuable. And so we expanded it to 3 people at this point. Again, they have a different system now. I'm not even sure exactly how it works, but they have a different system now, and back in the day, this is how it worked. But the Aphelios pod was Hax Defender as the lead, Madness Hero as the secondary, and then myself as the third member of the pod. And if you're wondering, wow, this guy never talks about Aphelios, weird that he was on the analysis pod. Don't worry, I'll get to that. But normally, the way that normally things worked was the pod members would typically play a good few games of the champion, like in the GAP playtests, right? Where part of the value of them being on the pod was to be able to provide an informed perspective of like what the experience of playing the champion is like, how they like it, like how it works for players like them, how it works for other players, that kind of thing, right? But with Aphelios, we intentionally deviated from that, knowing from the very beginning that Aphelios was going to be an extremely high mastery champion that was going to be extremely difficult and require a lot of games to master. One of the things to note is that we don't get to play that many games of a champion before we ship them, right? Even if you think about the number of playtests that GAT can run in a given day, which isn't that many, by the way. They typically run 3 or 4. But even if you could play them in all, like a single champion in every single GAT playtest, which is not realistic, right? They have to playtest more than just champions. You can't always jam every single champion into every single test. That just doesn't work. The reality is just champions are in development for less than a year most of the time. And they change a lot over development, right? And so a lot of your experience from early versions of the champion will not translate to later versions because they'll just change a lot, right? And so even if you're grinding it out, playing a champion 3 times every business day, and you're grinding out the mastery, you might get like 150 games, something like that. In 2 or 3 weeks after the champion comes out, there will be players on live with way more games than that, right? Like, because you'll think about the people playing on live. There will be lots of players who will grind out hundreds of games on a new champion in 3 or 4 weeks, as an example, right? if they're not banned too much, and that's actually possible. Even if they are banned a lot, some people will just dodge and get a lot of experience on a new champion. Anyway, don't need to get into all of that. But we intentionally decided to concentrate our Aphelios games onto, uh, in particular, Hax Defender, but to a lesser extent, Madness Hero. By the way, actually, all three of us still work at Riot. In fact, actually, Hax Defender left and came back. But all three of members of the Aphelios analysis pod actually are still working at Riot Games, which is cool. But anyway, we intentionally decided to concentrate most of our games onto Hax Defender, which was not standard. And so I was kind of left out as the sort of third odd man out, which I was partially there to provide the perspective of like, I was not a massive AD carry player, right? Like I play AD carry, right? I play all the roles, but I'm not like some super huge AD carry player, especially not like these hyper carries, right? I typically play, like Tristana or like a Kaisa or whatever, right? And I do play Sivir, but Sivir is obviously very, very, very different from what we were going for Aphelios. But anyway, I ended up being kind of like knowing from the beginning I was not going to be providing a whole lot to the pod. However, there was one specific moment that I feel like I actually provided real value, which was when we were moving towards the very end of locking down how exactly all of Aphelios's guns worked. There was a big iteration coming in for, I think it was Infernum. I think Infernum was the last gun to get locked down, if I remember correctly. But there was basically, I know the specifics of what I remember were there was some big iteration for one of the guns coming in, and Madness Hero and Hax Defender had both already played the iteration that we were on several times. They're like, okay, this is your moment. You can get there. They were talking to me like, you can get in there and try this out so that you can finally have something relevant to say about your experience playing Aphelios. And so I said, okay, cool. Like, let me try it out. And what I did in that one game that I played, and I think in total over the course of development, by the way, I probably played like 4 or 5 games when we just found like extra like slots that I could slot into. So I didn't literally play never, but this one game of Aphelios I played before we locked down all the guns. One of the things that I felt pretty strongly about in the game that I was playing was like, okay, look, number one, I can't play this champion. This is too hard for me. Especially with no mastery, right? Like, going in first time is very difficult for Aphelios, especially back then. The UI was much less good than what you experienced on live if you've ever played Aphelios. So the indication for all of this stuff was much worse. But I was like, okay, this champion, first of all, it's hard. However, one of the things that I felt was, I realized when I was playing him in lane, like, oh wait, if you get a gun to 10 or less ammo, and you fire it off its Q ability, and you instantly swap to the next gun, what you can do is essentially just set yourself up so that you have 2 guns at low ammo, and then just get 4 abilities in a given all-in. And so once I think I probably figured that in the first like 5-6 minutes of the game, something like that. And once I started doing that, I actually crushed lane. Like I completely dominated in a way that even at the time, Hax Defender and Madness Hero were not crushing lane in the same way, right? He was definitely overpowered at the time, to be clear. Like, he was very overpowered for most development, and in fact shipped very overpowered. But I was doing something like this messed up thing in lane that Hax Defender and Madness Hero were not doing at the time. Like, no one else was doing at the time. I was like, look, this is something that you can do. And I remember going to the Aphelios pod sync, which was with Stashu, the designer who was working on Aphelios at the time, and the rest of the Gap pod. And I was like, look, you could do this really powerful thing. And if you let him do this, this will really be what all of his laning phase power is tuned around. Is you won't be able to tune these spells to be very satisfying, because you will have to tune him around just throwing 4 spells in quick succession at people on an all-in, right? And so Stashu's solution to this, which I think made a lot of sense, was to say, oh, actually, it would make a lot of sense if there was a moment when you swapped guns where you couldn't attack. And that not only actually removes this, doesn't really remove it, it reduces the power of this optimization around using your spell and then switching guns. It's still good to do this, by the way, in some cases, right? But it reduces the power of this optimization to something that we can stomach, right? Especially for the laning phase purposes. And it also allows us to do a lot of a clever communication effect of hey, you can't attack right now, and Aphelios is playing this unique gun swapping animation where he's pulling up a new gun, and that allows us to communicate to the player that there is a significant state change that doesn't require them to look at their HUD. Right. And so even if they're looking at Aphelios, they can see, his state has changed, even if they're not looking super, super, super closely at his gun or at his HUD or whatever, right? Like you can see, hey, I shot a bullet, and then Aphelios started doing, all those, bringing out his new gun. He swapped up. All right, he has, now you have Calibrum, and you it's much more intuitive to understand that you have a new, different gun, and your auto attacks will now have different properties. And so I think it was a really clever solve around, both using using this swapping mechanism, like the swapping lockout, to both solve a like balancing concern around how that meant that we would have to tune the spells themselves. Like the spells would have had to be a lot weaker if we didn't have this, and also using it to communicate something, do some better visual communication of the mechanics, which can be really hard to learn and hard to understand, especially for newer Aphelios players. I think it was a really, really, really clever solve. And that was really my main contribution to Aphelios' entire development. The only other real thing I did was I showed up to all of those Aphelios pod meetings every week that I was talking about, and I took notes. So that was that's it. Like, if you're wondering, like, what was the third member of the Aphelios analysis pod doing? It was that. It was providing that one relevant piece of feedback and then showing up to the meetings and taking notes. That is my contribution to Aphelios. So yeah, you can thank me later, Aphelios players. I'm very magnanimous. Anyway, yes. So to wrap back around to the question, now that I've told this kind of, I guess, tangentially relevant story about Aphelios' development to this mechanic, this is something I think is a really interesting idea, because to me, I actually think it makes some sense that, hey, the thing that locks out your auto attack could probably be a little bit less restrictive as you get more attack speed. That actually doesn't seem unreasonable to me at all. The question I have is like, okay, do the animations still look good, and are they still readable when this lockout is lower? And would this mean that we would have to make the lockout baseline a little bit longer? Because I'm not sure how much lower we could actually get it before this like the cost of switching guns is just like almost nothing. That's just something where it's like, I don't know the numbers. Like I don't know enough, I don't know the depth of the numbers. But ultimately the answer is, because Stashu didn't put this there originally, and we weren't originally looking at a version of Aphelios where we were constantly wishing that he liked attack speed more. However, in the modern day, I think we would love it if attack speed was more attractive on Aphelios, if people actually wanted to buy attack speed items more, and like were more invested into DPS rather than burst. Not to say that I think you can't play a caster Aphelios, right? I want to be clear about that. I think caster Aphelios is fine. It's just we would like it if attack speed was more attractive for him and was like more compelling of a stat for him. And so this is the kind of thing where I think this is something that I've been talking with some of the other designers a little bit about this concept since I saw this question, because I think it's a really interesting concept. And I've just been kind of workshopping the idea around, not saying we will or won't do it at any point in the future, but it's a very interesting idea that I think has some potential merit around, hey, this is one of the things, we do wish that Aphelios cared more about attack speed. Can we change this? I'm not actually sure, right? A lot of it comes down to like how the animation works and how it looks faster, like how long the exact lockout is right now, because I'm not sure what that number is, that kind of thing. But ultimately, the answer is, because we didn't do it originally, because we didn't think that was necessary. However, looking at the current state of Aphelios, it might be a better version of Aphelios if his lockout, did scale a bit with attack speed. I could see that, but not sure. But it is an interesting thought, and so thank you very much for this question. It's, I think, maybe one of the most interesting ones I've answered in quite some time. Is it correct for the game to have champions that do not want to instantly upgrade their ultimates? I think the way this question is framing it is maybe a little extreme. Like, is it correct? To me, this is less about is it right or is it wrong, and more about what's the value proposition here. To me, I think the case that I think is actually really wrong, that I think about in this space that I really dislike, is Tryndamere, right? Tryndamere, his ult is one of the high moments on the kit, right? It's like, this is, you literally become unkillable. This is like a crazy thing that he does. It's a complete, very unique outputs, like one of the main things Tryndamere does. It's like a core part of his fantasy that like, this is the guy that does not die, right? It's like, I mean, that's why it's in the cinematic, right? Go look at what's the name of that one? It's Still Here, where it's like, it's such a cool moment. You see Tryndamere's eyes light up red. It's like, oh, it's Undying Rage. He can't die right now, right? That's so sick. It's such a core part of the champion that, to me, it not being right to sometimes not being right to put points into it feels really wrong. That like, if you have a core fantasy spell that isn't, you don't care about maxing. I'm less concerned with some of the other cases that we have today or have seen previously, like Vlad, for example, not caring that much about points in his ultimate is like, It's like, is it ideal? I don't know, probably not. But like, I'm not that bothered by it because for Vlad, it's like, well, Vlad's the blood guy. All of his spells are blood spells, right? It's like, the core fantasy of the character, the optimizations here. I don't mind if sometimes you want more points in your E rather than points in your ultimate. And that can be good. That seems fine to me for people who really want to optimize. I do think that there are versions of this that are too extreme. Like if we had to actively tune Vlad around these optimizations, as an example, where like, oh, noob Vlad players are losing 3% win rate because they put points in their ultimate, haha, idiots, right? It's like that's the kind of thing where I look at that and say, okay, that's probably too extreme, right? Like that's probably too much power associated with this really unintuitive optimization. And so that might be a case where maybe we should make adjustments. But I think the power level of the ones that we have in the game, to me currently, like that I'm aware of, at least in the current game, don't seem that extreme. And so to me, being able to get a little bit of value out of not putting points in your ultimate on a few champions that where their ultimate is not a part of their core fantasy, that feels okay to me. However, the Tryndamere case though does bother me that and I do think we should make putting points in Tryndamere good enough that it is very clear that you should always be doing it. I don't know exactly what that means. I think we've actually buffed the rank up incentive at some point in the last few years, I think, or at least we talked about doing. I don't remember if we ever actually did. But just generally, I think to me the bar that we get at here is not necessarily is this bad in all cases, but when is this uh when is it important that you feel good about putting points in your ultimate? Like, well, generally, right? Like, I think it should feel good to put points in your spells, generally speaking, and your ultimate as a concentration of power on your kit probably on average should feel better than putting points in the rest of your spells. However, that doesn't have to be universally true across the entire roster. Like, kind of a relevant point here is that just because something is usually true for champions in League of Legends, champions get to do a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that a given individual champion isn't allowed to subvert the rules or be different, right? Like our champions are allowed to be different, right? And I think that's good for the game, right? Like that we have champions that offer different optimizations, right? Great example of this is Kai'Sa, where it's like, well, some players don't want to think about Kai'Sa's evolve breakpoints, and that's fine, right? It's awesome that Kai'Sa exists for the players that do want to think about those things and do want to optimize those builds and think about the different ways that they can go about satisfying those thresholds, right? Same thing with like Riven, right? It's like Riven has these animation cancels that matter a lot to her, right? Or Q cancel, which matters a lot, and even things like double casting that matter a fair amount for her, right? And it's like if you don't want to opt into those things, you don't want those kinds of optimizations, that's fine. You don't have to play Riven, right? That's one of the values of having a really big roster and having just lots of different champions that we can have that offer different experiences in the game is that we do have access to these different having these different things. And so a champion or two having optimizations like this, if that's in line with their fantasy, like their basic spells are really important to them, fine with me. However, again, the case where I think this maybe doesn't work quite as well, the Tryndamere case does not sit super rightly with me because I do think that Tryndamere should be happy about putting points in the ultimate, just given what that spell means for him, like how that spell is situated on his kit. And so that's the kind of thing where I don't know literally on live right now if it's optimal to put extra points into Tryndamere R or not, but I do think it would the game would be better if Tryndamere was excited to put points in his ultimate, generally speaking, right? And I think that's true for most champions, but I think it's okay if there are some cases where putting a point in your ultimate is fine and you're interested in doing that, but putting a point in a basic ability could be more exciting. I think that's okay for a few kits across the roster. I do think that generally ultimates should be more exciting to put points into than basic abilities, but that doesn't have to be true for literally everyone in order for the structure of the game to be good. Anyway, that is going to be it for today. Thank you everybody for watching, and maybe catch you in number 38. And looks like I will need to refresh up my sheet. So if you are someone who is interested in getting questions in, then head over to my Discord and put in some questions because I will need to be pulling in some new ones for the sheet for the next Q&A. And I'll probably have to do that sometime this coming week. But yeah, thanks for watching and maybe catch you next time.